The observation deck of the Terran exploration vessel Horizons stretched out like a transparent membrane between humanity and the most terrifying creature in the known universe. Lieutenant Marcus Chen stood perfectly still, his breath measured and calm, eyes locked onto the Chronos apex that dominated the alien landscape before him. The planet Xerax-9 was nothing like Earth. Its atmosphere churned with metallic purple clouds that crackled with electromagnetic energy. Jagged crystal formations jutted from the ground like the broken teeth of a primordial giant, casting prismatic shadows across a terrain that seemed more like a weapon than a natural environment. This was the native hunting ground of the most feared predator in the galactic cluster, a species so lethal that entire civilizations had been erased from existence by its mere presence. Ken's communication implant chirped softly, breaking the tense silence. A holographic overlay flickered to life, displaying urgent messages from the Galactic Council's Xenobiology Division. Red warning indicators flashed with increasing intensity, each one a stark reminder of the absolute protocols surrounding Chronos Apex encounters. Minimum safe distance, 5,000 meters threat level, catastrophic interaction, strictly prohibited. The messages were clear. No species had ever survived a direct encounter with a Chronos Apex. No technological defense had ever proven effective against its instantaneous threat response. The creature was living biological weaponry, evolved to be the perfect predator in an universe of predators. Standing 8 meters tall, the Chronos Apex was a nightmare of biological engineering. Its exoskeleton resembled living crystal, each facet capable of shifting and realigning to create the most optimal defensive or offensive configuration in microseconds. Neural pathways that ran through its crystalline structure processed threat information faster than most computer systems could even register an input. The creature's sensory array was a complex network of perception that went beyond simple sight, sound, or electromagnetic detection. It could read quantum fluctuations, detect microscopic changes in gravitational fields, and assess potential threats across multiple dimensional spectra. Where other species saw a landscape, the Chronos Apex saw a comprehensive threat matrix, constantly recalculating and preparing for absolute survival. Dr. Elena Rodriguez's voice crackled through Chen's communication implant. As lead xenobiologist for the mission, she was monitoring every microscopic detail from the ship's primary research station. Marcus, you're pushing well beyond acceptable safety protocols. The Council will revoke our exploration license if you take one more step forward. Chen didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the Chronos Apex, which had now fully turned its primary sensory cluster towards him. The movement was so precise, so calculated, that it looked more like a weapon system activating than a living creature moving. The mission logs would later show that in that moment, every single sensor on the horizon went into a state of complete panic. Threat assessment algorithms began firing at rates never before recorded. The ship's quantum eye began calculating potential survival scenarios, each one ending with a 99.9997% probability of total mission failure. What the sensors couldn't detect was the singular human quality that Marcus Chen was about to demonstrate. Something that no sophisticated threat assessment system could ever truly comprehend. Genuine, unfiltered empathy. Generations of human explorers had approached alien encounters with a mixture of scientific curiosity, military caution, or diplomatic strategy. Chen represented something different. To him, the Chronos Apex wasn't just a threat to be assessed or a scientific specimen to be studied. It was a sentient being, a complex life form with its own evolutionary history, its own form of consciousness. the crystal-like structures of the Kronos apex began to shift. Microscopic realignments suggested it was preparing its primary threat response, a process that had, in every recorded encounter, resulted in complete biological elimination of the approaching entity. But Marcus Chen did not move. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not activate any defensive shield. He simply stood, a fragile human form against the most sophisticated predatory system in the known universe, waiting. And in that waiting, something extraordinary was about to happen. The moment stretched into an eternity of potential violence. Every quantum of energy on the planet seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the inevitable destruction that had defined every previous encounter with a Kronos apex. In the ship's observation deck, Dr. Elena Rodriguez watched the live feed with growing tension. Her hands moved frantically across holographic interfaces, running every possible analysis, searching for some rational explanation for Chen's impossible stillness. "Marcus," she whispered into the communication channel, "you need to retreat. Now." The Kronos apex's crystalline structure began to pulse with an intricate pattern of energy. Each shift was a calculation, a threat assessment that had been perfected through millions of years of evolutionary warfare. Its sensory array was a complex network that could detect the most minute changes in quantum fluctuations, electromagnetic fields, and biological signatures. And yet, it did not attack. Chen took a single deliberate breath. Not a breath of fear, not a breath of aggression, just a breath of presence. "Hey there," he said softly. The words were so simple, so utterly mundane, that they caused a complete breakdown in the Kronos apex's threat assessment protocols. No previous encounter had ever included something so casual. On the horizon, the quantum array began to overheat. Its threat matrices were collapsing, unable to process the complete irrationality of the moment. Probability calculations spun into impossible configurations. How could a single human, standing alone, facing the most lethal predator in the known universe, sound so utterly nonchalant? Dr. Rodriguez pulled up the communication logs, her hands trembling slightly. The linguistic analysis programs began to break down Chen's vocal patterns, searching for some hidden strategy, some complex diplomatic coding. They found nothing, just two words. "Hey there." The Kronos apex's crystalline structures began to shift in patterns never before recorded. Where previous interactions had resulted in instantaneous threat elimination, this encounter was generating something entirely new. Quantum entanglement sensors showed bizarre fluctuations, as if the very fabric of potential interaction was being rewritten. Preliminary linguistic analysis is inconclusive, the ship's A reported, its synthetic voice betraying a hint of confusion. Subject communication does not match any known diplomatic, aggressive, or defensive communication pattern. Chen took a microscopic step forward. The entire universe seemed to hold its breath. On the horizon, the Galactic Council's observation team watched in absolute horror. Representatives from a dozen different species leaned forward, their various appendages and sensory organs focused on the impossible scene unfolding before them. A human, talking to a Kronos apex, as if it were nothing more than a slightly interesting animal. The communication channels erupted with a cacophony of reactions. Xenobiologists argued about potential communication strategies. Military strategists began recalculating every known threat assessment model. Diplomatic experts tried to parse the impossible complexity of the moment. No one had ever survived this close to a Kronos apex, let alone spoken to one. Chen's communication implant picked up the frantic chatter. Dozens of voices overlapped, each more panicked than the last. Warnings, calculations, desperate pleas for retreat. He ignored them all. His eyes remained locked on the creature, a steady and calm defiance of every known rule of interspecies interaction. Where other explorers saw a threat, Chen saw a complex being. Where military strategists saw a weapon, he saw a form of life shaped by its own unique evolutionary path. The Chronos Apex's primary sensory cluster continued its intricate dance of quantum assessment. Threat indicators flickered and died. Elimination protocols became confused, then inert. Something unprecedented was happening. And humanity was about to rewrite the rules of first contact, one impossible moment at a time. Physical contact was impossible. At least, that's what every scientific model in the known galaxy claimed. The Chronos Apex's crystalline exoskeleton represented the pinnacle of evolutionary defensive technology. Each microscopic facet could reconfigure instantaneously, generating molecular-level force fields that would typically vaporize anything attempting to breach its personal space. Entire planetary defense systems had been obliterated by less than a touch. When Marcus Chen's hand moved forward, the universe seemed to pause. Dr. Elena Rodriguez's voice crackled through the communication system, a mixture of scientific fascination and pure terror. "Quantum field readings are going completely nonlinear," she muttered, more to herself than to anyone listening. This is impossible." The moment Chen's fingers made contact with the creature's exterior, something extraordinary happened. The crystalline structure did not react with violence. It did not generate a defensive pulse. It did not eliminate the threat. Instead, the microscopic crystal facets began to shift in a pattern that defied every known biological response mechanism. Xenobiologists would later describe it as a form of quantum resonance. Military strategists would call it a complete systems breakdown. But in that moment, it was something far more profound. The Chronos Apex was experiencing something entirely new. Communication had always been a weapon for this species. Every interaction was a calculation of threat, of survival, of absolute dominance. Physical contact meant elimination. Proximity meant destruction. These were the fundamental rules that had allowed the species to survive in the most hostile environments imaginable. But this human was different. Chen's touch was not an invasion. It was not a threat. It was something the creature had never experienced before, a form of contact that carried no aggressive intent. His hand moved with a gentleness that seemed to communicate something beyond physical sensation. The ship's sensors went into overdrive. Quantum entanglement monitors showed impossible readings. Probability matrices collapsed. Threat assessment algorithms began to short-circuit, unable to process the complete irrationality of the moment. On the Horizon's observation deck, the Galactic Council's representatives watched in absolute disbelief. Delegates from 100 different species leaned forward, their various sensory organs focused on the impossible scene unfolding before them. A human, touching a Chronos Apex, as if it were nothing more than a curious animal. The communication channels erupted into a cacophony of reactions. Xenobiologists began arguing about potential communication strategies. Military strategists recalculated every known threat assessment model. Diplomatic experts tried to parse the impossible complexity of the moment. Chen's hand continued its gentle movement. There was no science to it. No calculated diplomatic strategy. Just a fundamental human capacity for connection that defied every known interspecies interaction protocol. Fascinating, Dr. Rodriguez whispered, her scientific detachment momentarily shattered. The Chronos Apex's crystalline structure began to undergo changes that no sensor could fully comprehend. Where previous encounters had resulted in immediate and total destruction, this interaction generated something entirely new. Quantum fluctuation sensors detected a type of communication that went beyond electromagnetic signals, beyond sound, beyond any known form of interspecies interaction. It was almost as if the creature was learning, not just processing information, but experiencing a form of communication that had never existed in its evolutionary history. Every previous interaction had been about survival, about threat, about absolute elimination. This was different. This was connection. The Galactic Council's emergency communication channel lit up with incoming messages, urgent, confused, demanding explanations for the impossible scene unfolding on their screens. But Marcus Chen remained focused. His hand continued its gentle movement, a study in calm defiance of every known rule of interspecies interaction. Where other explorers saw a threat, he saw a complex being. Where military strategists saw a weapon, he saw a form of life shaped by its own unique evolutionary path. Something unprecedented was happening. And humanity was about to rewrite the rules of first contact, one impossible moment at a time. The emergency session of the Galactic Council descended into chaos. Holographic displays flickered with the impossible imagery. A human hand gently moving across the crystalline exoskeleton of the most feared predator in known space. Representatives from 100 different species watched in various states of disbelief, horror, and morbid fascination. Ambassador Krelnaxi of the Varaxian Confederation slammed 3 of his 4 appendages against the Council's communication console. This is a violation of every known first contact protocol, he screeched, his translator rendering the words in a dozen different linguistic matrices. The human must be immediately extracted, terminated, studied. Dr. Lyra Chen, no relation to Marcus, stood at the secondary research station of the horizon, her hands dancing across quantum analysis interfaces. Every sensor, every monitoring system was producing data that defied comprehension. The Kronos Apex's threat indicators weren't just lowered. They were essentially non-existent. Quantum resonance is showing completely unprecedented patterns, she muttered into her communication link. It's as if the creature is learning. On the surface of Xerax 9, Marcus continued his gentle interaction. His touch was rhythmic, almost musical, a pattern that seemed to communicate something far beyond physical contact. Where previous encounters with the Kronos Apex had lasted microseconds and ended in total destruction, this moment stretched into minutes. The creature's crystalline structure began to pulse with a complexity that defied every known biological response model. Quantum entanglement sensors showed interactions that should have been impossible. The very fabric of potential communication was being rewritten. Linguistic analysis is inconclusive, the Horizon's Quantum A reported, its synthetic voice betraying a hint of confusion. Subject's physical interaction does not match any known diplomatic, scientific, or defensive communication strategy. Ambassador Krelnaxi wasn't finished. Humans have always been reckless, he continued, his translator providing a perfect rendering of his contempt. But this is beyond scientific curiosity. This is a direct threat to galactic stability. The council chamber erupted into a cacophony of translations, arguments, and pure disbelief. Dr. Elena Rodriguez watched the live feed with a mixture of scientific fascination and pure terror. Her hands moved across holographic interfaces, running every possible analysis. The Kronos Apex had destroyed entire civilizations. Planetary defense systems had fallen in microseconds against its threat response. And yet, here was Marcus Chen, touching it, communicating with it, as if it were nothing more than a curious animal. The quantum data was unlike anything ever recorded. Where previous scientific models showed absolute threat elimination as the only possible outcome, these readings suggested something entirely new. The Kronos apex wasn't just not attacking, it was engaging in a form of communication that went beyond any known interspecies interaction. We're witnessing something unprecedented. Dr. Rodriguez whispered into her communication link. This isn't just first contact. This is a complete reimagining of interspecies communication. On the planet's surface, Marcus continued his gentle movement. There was no fear in his touch, no aggression, just a fundamental human capacity for connection that seemed to defy every known scientific principle. The Kronos apex's sensory clusters continued their complex dance. Threat indicators that had defined the species' entire evolutionary history began to collapse. Elimination protocols became confused, then inert. Ambassador Kralnax's final argument died in his throat as the holographic display showed something impossible. The Kronos apex, the most feared predator in the known universe, seemed to be leaning into the human's touch. Not attacking, not preparing to eliminate, simply experiencing. Something unprecedented was happening. And humanity was about to rewrite the rules of first contact, one impossible moment at a time. The technological disruption began quietly, almost imperceptibly. Within days of the first contact, research teams across the galaxy began receiving quantum communication fragments that defied every known scientific model. Dr. Elena Rodriguez's initial research notes spread through academic and military networks like a quantum wildfire, challenging everything known about interspecies communication. The Galactic Confederation's primary research division went into immediate lockdown. Classified memos flew between departments, each more desperate than the last. How could a single human interaction with the Kronos apex potentially unravel centuries of established xenobiological understanding? Dr. Marcus Chen's preliminary report was a masterpiece of understated revolution. Where most scientific documents would be filled with technical jargon and defensive posturing, his account was almost disappointingly simple. He described the encounter not as a scientific breakthrough, but as a moment of genuine connection. Communication is not about threat assessment, one passage read. It's about understanding. The first wave of disruption came from psychology departments across multiple species. Research teams began questioning fundamental assumptions about threat response, biological communication, and interspecies interactions. If a human could communicate with the Kronos apex, what other impossible interactions might be possible? Military strategists were the first to feel genuine panic. The Kronos apex had been the ultimate deterrent. A living weapon so terrifying that entire civilizations had restructured their defensive strategies around its potential threat. Now that foundation was crumbling. If humans had found a way to communicate with the creature, what did that mean for established power structures? Diplomatic channels became a maze of emergency communications. The Galactic Confederation called an unprecedented series of emergency sessions. Representatives from 100 different species tried to understand the implications of what had happened on Xerax 9. Dr. Rodriguez's research team began receiving communication requests from species that had previously been considered unreachable. Civilizations that had existed in isolated pockets, terrified of potential interspecies conflict, now showed a tentative interest in communication. The quantum communication networks began to change. Where previous interactions had been based on threat assessment and diplomatic caution, a new model of communication began to emerge. It was subtle at first, A slight shift in communication protocols, a new approach to understanding that went beyond traditional diplomatic strategies. Humans had always been considered a marginal species, technologically behind, emotionally unpredictable, prone to irrational behavior. Now they were being seen in an entirely different light. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source. The Zorn Collective, a species known for its absolute commitment to logical interaction, requested a full research exchange. They wanted to understand the communication methodology that had made the impossible possible. Chen's research notes became a mandatory study document across multiple academic and diplomatic institutions. Where previous first contact protocols had been about maintaining distance and assessing threat, his approach suggested something revolutionary: genuine connection. Military think tanks began to panic. If communication could replace conflict, what would happen to established defensive strategies? Entire industries built around interspecies conflict began to see their foundations crumbling. The Chronos apex itself became a subject of unprecedented study. Previous research had focused entirely on its threat potential. Now, researchers wanted to understand its cognitive processes, its potential for communication, its basic biological and psychological makeup. Dr. Rodriguez's team discovered something even more remarkable. The Chronos apex wasn't just tolerating human interaction. It was showing signs of what could only be described as curiosity. Communication networks began to shift. Diplomatic channels that had been frozen for centuries started to show signs of movement. Species that had existed in complete isolation began to show tentative interest in broader galactic communication. Humanity had done something unprecedented. They had not conquered through military might. They had not dominated through technological superiority. They had connected. And in that connection, they were rewriting the fundamental rules of interspecies interaction. The technological disruption was just beginning. Quantum diplomacy was nothing like traditional interstellar negotiations. The first joint diplomatic mission, featuring Marcus Chen and the Chronos Apex, arrived at the Central Galactic Diplomatic Hub, a massive space station that had historically been a fortress of rigid protocols and carefully maintained species separation. Diplomatic representatives from 100 different civilizations watched in stunned silence as Chen walked alongside the creature that had once been considered the ultimate harbinger of destruction. Ambassador Kralnaxi of the Varaxian Confederation stood at the primary observation platform, his four appendages trembling with a mixture of fear and unprecedented curiosity. The diplomatic protocols he had spent centuries mastering seemed utterly irrelevant in the face of this impossible interaction. The human does not command, Dr. Elena Rodriguez's research report noted, nor does the Chronos apex submit. They communicate. It was a fundamental difference that broke every existing model of interspecies interaction. The diplomatic hub's quantum communication networks began to register interactions that defied traditional linguistic translation. Where previous communications had been rigid, structured, laden with threat assessments and defensive posturing, this new form of interaction was fluid, dynamic, almost organic. Chen moved with a calm that seemed to radiate something beyond simple human confidence. His interactions with the Chronos apex suggested a form of communication that went beyond verbal or physical language. It was something more fundamental, a recognition of sentience that transcended species boundaries. The first diplomatic session was nothing like anyone expected. Instead of prepared statements and carefully crafted diplomatic language, Chen simply introduced the Chronos apex as a fellow being. Not a weapon, not a threat. Just another sentient entity with its own complex history and potential. Species that had existed in complete isolation for millennia began to show interest. The communication networks buzzed with unprecedented activity. Research teams from a dozen different civilizations requested access to the quantum interaction logs. "We've been approaching communication wrong," Chen explained during a subsequent research symposium. "Every interaction doesn't need to be about dominance or survival. Sometimes it's about understanding." The Galactic Confederation's diplomatic corps was in complete disarray. Entire departments dedicated to threat assessment and species isolation found themselves suddenly irrelevant. The rigid hierarchical structures that had maintained galactic peace through carefully managed conflict were crumbling. The Kronos apex itself became a subject of fascination. Previous research had focused entirely on its threat potential. Now, researchers wanted to understand its cognitive processes, its potential for communication, its basic biological and psychological makeup. Dr. Rodriguez's research team discovered something even more remarkable. The creature wasn't just tolerating human interaction. It was showing signs of what could only be described as genuine curiosity. Diplomatic channels that had been frozen for centuries began to show signs of movement. Species that had existed in complete isolation started to demonstrate a tentative interest in broader galactic communication. The quantum diplomacy model was simple yet revolutionary. Instead of approaching other species with fear or potential threat, the human approach suggested something radical: genuine connection based on mutual understanding. Military strategists watched in growing concern. If communication could replace conflict, what would happen to established defensive strategies? Entire industries built around interspecies tension began to see their foundations crumbling. The Zorn Collective, a species known for its absolute commitment to logical interaction, was the first to formally request a full research exchange. They wanted to understand the communication methodology that had made the impossible possible. Chen's approach wasn't about technological superiority or military might. It was about something far more fundamental: a recognition of sentience that went beyond species boundaries, a willingness to approach the unknown with curiosity instead of fear. The diplomatic hub continued to buzz with activity. Representatives from 100 different species watched in a mixture of confusion and growing fascination. Humanity had done something unprecedented. They had not conquered. They had not dominated. They had connected. And in that connection, they were rewriting the fundamental rules of interstellar interaction. The transformation began slowly, then all at once. Research stations across the galaxy started reporting unprecedented breakthroughs in interspecies communication. What had once been considered impossible was now becoming a standard of diplomatic and scientific interaction. The quantum communication models developed from the initial human Kronos apex encounter were reshaping entire scientific disciplines. Dr. Elena Rodriguez stood before the Galactic Research Symposium, her presentation challenging everything previously understood about sentient communication. The holographic displays behind her showed complex quantum interaction patterns that looked more like living art than scientific data. "Communication is not about translation," she explained, her voice calm and resolute. "It's about recognition. Recognition of sentience beyond our own limited understanding." The Kronos apex, once the most feared predator in known space, had become something entirely different. It was no longer just a weapon of mass destruction, but a participant in a broader galactic dialogue. Research teams discovered layers of cognitive complexity that had been hidden behind millennia of threat-based interactions. Military academies across multiple species began restructuring their entire approach to potential conflicts. The old models of threat assessment and preemptive defensive strategies were being systematically dismantled. Instead, new courses emerged focused on empathy, communication, and understanding. The Voraxian Confederation, once the most militaristic of galactic powers, was the first major political entity to completely overhaul its diplomatic approach. Ambassador Krelnaxi, who had initially been the most vocal opponent of the human interaction, now led the charge for a new form of galactic communication. "We were blind," Krelnaxi proclaimed during a landmark speech, blind to the possibility that threat is often just a lack of understanding. Research into the quantum communication protocols revealed something extraordinary. The human approach wasn't just about peaceful interaction. It was a fundamental reimagining of how sentient beings could understand each other. Dr. Rodriguez's team discovered that the communication method went beyond traditional linguistic or technological barriers. It was a form of interaction that recognized the fundamental sentience of different species, regardless of their biological or technological differences. Entire planetary defense systems were being dismantled. Species that had existed in perpetual conflict for thousands of years began to find common ground. The rigid hierarchical structures of the Galactic Confederation began to crumble, replaced by more fluid, empathetic interaction models. The transformation wasn't just political or scientific. It was deeply philosophical. Civilizations that had previously been isolated began to reach out. Species that had been considered too alien, too dangerous, or too incomprehensible were now being approached with genuine curiosity and openness. The Chronos apex itself became a symbol of this transformation. What had once been the ultimate symbol of destructive potential was now a living testament to the power of understanding. Research teams discovered layers of cognitive complexity that had been hidden behind millennia of threat-based interactions. Educational systems across multiple species began to change. Instead of focusing on defensive strategies and threat assessment, new curricula emerged that emphasized empathy, communication, and mutual understanding. Marcus Chen's original approach, that communication was about connection rather than conflict, became a fundamental philosophical principle across multiple civilizations. The quantum communication networks continued to expand. Each new interaction revealed more about the complex nature of sentient communication. It wasn't about finding common ground, but about recognizing the validity of different experiences and perspectives. Dr. Rodriguez's research suggested that this was just the beginning. The human approach to communication was revealing something fundamental about the nature of sentience itself. It wasn't about similarity, but about recognition. The Galactic Confederation's structure was completely transformed. What had once been a rigid political entity focused on maintaining careful separations between species was now a dynamic network of mutual understanding. Military budgets were redirected towards communication research. Diplomatic academies emerged that taught the principles of empathetic interaction. The entire concept of first contact was being reimagined. Humanity had done something unprecedented. They had not conquered through force. They had not dominated through technology. They had transformed galactic interaction through a simple, profound recognition of sentience. And in that recognition, they were rewriting the fundamental rules of existence. 10 years after that first impossible moment, on Xerax 9, Marcus Chen stood at the center of a truly diverse galactic assembly. The central hall of the Galactic Diplomatic Hub was a testament to the impossible. Species that had once existed in complete isolation now sat, or hovered, or pulsed, or whatever their unique form of existence required, in a circular configuration that symbolized true equality. The Chronos apex sat beside Chen, no longer viewed as a weapon, but as a diplomatic partner. Its crystalline structure had become something of a legend, a living symbol of the transformation that had reshaped galactic civilization. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, now the primary director of interspecies communication research, stepped forward to deliver the keynote address. Her presentation wasn't a scientific report, but a reflection on a fundamental shift in understanding. "We were wrong," she began, her voice carrying across the assembly. "Completely and utterly wrong about the nature of communication, of understanding, of existence itself." The assembled representatives listened in complete silence. Delegates from 100 different species, some carbon-based, some energy-based, some forms of existence humanity had barely comprehended a decade ago, waited with a collective breath. The transformation had been more profound than anyone could have imagined. Military academies across the galaxy had been completely dismantled. The concept of defensive strategy had been replaced by communication research. Entire economic systems had been restructured around the principle of mutual understanding rather than competition or conflict. Ken reflected on the moment that had started it all. A simple touch. A moment of genuine connection that had defied every known scientific and diplomatic protocol. The Chronos apex beside him pulsed with a complex pattern of quantum energy, a form of communication that had become as natural as breathing. Where once it had been the ultimate symbol of destructive potential, it was now a partner in galactic dialogue. "Communication is not about translation," Rodriguez continued. "It's about recognition of sentience that goes beyond our own limited understanding." The assembled representatives represented a cross-section of existence that would have been unimaginable a decade ago. Some were biological entities. Some were pure energy forms. Some existed in quantum states that defied traditional understanding of consciousness. But they were all here, together. Chen's original approach, that every sentient being deserved recognition, understanding, and respect, had become the fundamental philosophical principle of galactic civilization. The quantum communication networks that had emerged from that first impossible interaction had transformed everything. They were no longer just communication systems, but living networks of mutual understanding. Each interaction revealed more about the complex nature of sentient experience. Ambassador Krelnaxi, who had once been the most vocal opponent of the human approach, now led the Galactic Confederation's Council of Mutual Understanding. The rigid hierarchical structures had been completely dismantled, replaced by a dynamic network of empathetic interaction. Dr. Rodriguez's final words hung in the air, a manifesto of a new way of existing. "We are not defined by our differences," she said. "We are defined by our capacity to recognize the sentience in others, to understand, to connect." The Chronos apex moved slightly, a gesture that would have once been interpreted as a threat. Now it was simply a form of communication, a recognition of shared existence. Marcus Chen looked out over the assembly. Humanity had not conquered the galaxy. They had not dominated through technological might or military power. They had transformed it through something far more powerful: understanding. The assembled representatives began to communicate, not through words, not through traditional linguistic structures, but through a complex quantum interaction that represented true mutual recognition. And in that moment, the impossible became possible. The universe watched and understood.